January 1st, 1877. Queen Victoria is proclaimed Empress of India. The British Empire at this moment covers approximately 1/4 of the Earth's land surface. 450 million people live under the British flag. The Royal Navy controls every major ocean. British banks finance the global economy. British engineers are building railways on 6 continents. British law is being administered in territories from Canada to Australia to India to Nigeria to Malaya to the Caribbean. No empire in human history has ever controlled this much of the earth simultaneously. 68 years later, in August 1945, the war ends. 22 years after that, in 1967, Britain withdraws its military forces from east of Suez. The empire is functionally over. The question is what happened between 1877 and 1967. What happened to an empire that controlled 1/4 of the earth and then, within living memory, did not? The standard answer is decolonization, the rising tide of nationalism, the moral awakening that recognized empire as incompatible with the self-determination that Britain claimed to represent, the pressure from subject peoples who had decided they wanted to run their own countries. All of this is true. None of it is the primary reason. The primary reason the British Empire collapsed is not moral. It is financial. The empire did not end because Britain decided colonialism was wrong, though many British people eventually concluded that it was. It ended because Britain ran out of the money required to maintain it. And Britain ran out of money because of 2 wars that it fought and won, and that cost it everything it was fighting to preserve. This is a story of how an empire is not conquered but bankrupted, how the act of defending an empire can destroy the empire being defended, and how the most powerful financial system the world had ever seen was dismantled not by its enemies, but by the cost of defeating them. Start with money. The British Empire was not primarily a military project. It was a financial one. The Royal Navy was real and essential, but the instrument that built to maintain the empire was not warships. It was capital. British banks financed enterprises across the world. British investors owned railways, mines, plantations, and utilities in dozens of countries. British insurance companies underwrote global trade. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, accepted everywhere, trusted by everyone. The City of London, the square mile of financial institutions at the center of the British capital, was the global financial system in a way that Wall Street is today. If you needed to finance a large project anywhere in the world in 1900, you went to London. This financial dominance was the foundation of imperial power. It generated the returns that paid for the navy that protected the trade routes that generated the returns. The system was circular and self-reinforcing and had been building since the 18th century. In 1914, Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. It had more money invested overseas than any other country had ever had. It was owed more by other countries than any other nation. The pound was the currency of global commerce. British financial institutions sat at the center of a web of credit and debt and insurance and investment that touched every economy on earth. By 1945, Britain was the world's largest debtor nation. The transformation from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor happened in 31 years, across 2 world wars, through a financial hemorrhage so severe that it permanently altered Britain's position in the global economy. How this happened is the story of the empire's end. The First World War cost Britain approximately £11 billion in 1918 money. This was approximately double Britain's entire national income in 1913. The war was financed partly by taxation, partly by selling British overseas assets, and partly by borrowing, primarily from the United States. J.P. Morgan and the American financial system had become Britain's creditor by 1917. The relationship that would eventually transfer financial dominance from London to New York was forged in the specific urgency of Britain needing money to continue a war it was losing the financial capacity to sustain. Britain won the First World War. It emerged from it with debts to the United States that consumed a significant fraction of its national income through the 1920s. The attempt to restore the pound to its pre-war gold parity in 1925 which Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer implemented against the advice of Keynes and others, made British exports uncompetitive and contributed to the economic stagnation of the late 1920s. The financial cost of the First World War had not been paid when the Second World War began. The Second World War cost Britain approximately £30 billion in 1945 money. This was approximately 1.5 times Britain's entire national income in 1938. It was financed by even more aggressive sale of overseas assets, by lend-lease from the United States, and by borrowing on terms that were far more favorable to the lender than to the borrower. The lend-lease agreement that Roosevelt negotiated with Churchill in 1941 was essential to British survival. It was also a masterpiece of American financial strategy. The terms of lend-lease required that Britain not increase its exports during the war, to prevent Britain from using American-supplied goods to compete with American exports in third markets. They required that sterling area countries, the countries that held pounds as their reserve currency, be allowed to convert those pounds to dollars after the war. They required that Britain move toward convertibility of the pound. Each of these requirements was, individually, a reasonable wartime measure. Together, they were a systematic dismantling of the financial architecture that had sustained British imperial power. The American negotiators who designed these terms were not malicious. They were pursuing American interests with considerable skill. American interests in 1941 included access to markets that British imperial preference had closed to American exports. The Lend-Lease conditions opened those markets. The British needed the aid. They accepted the conditions. The man who negotiated for Britain was Keynes. He understood precisely what he was conceding and conceded it anyway because the alternative, fighting the war without American support, was not viable. He called the Lend-Lease negotiations a financial Dunkirk. Dunkirk had been a military retreat that saved the army but cost the equipment. Lend-Lease was a financial retreat that saved the war effort but cost the financial infrastructure of the empire. The war ended in 1945. Britain had won. Germany was destroyed. Japan was defeated. The map of the world showed the same territories as before, still formally British, still flying the Union Jack. But the financial position that had made those territories manageable was gone. Britain owed the United States approximately $4 billion under the 1945 Anglo-American Loan Agreement, negotiated after Lend-Lease ended. The loan carried interest. The interest payment consumed British foreign currency reserves at a rate that constrained every economic decision the post-war British government made. The sterling area, the network of countries that held pounds as their reserve currency and traded within a British-managed financial zone, was under pressure from convertibility requirements that the Americans had insisted on. The pound was not strong enough to withstand convertibility. When Britain briefly allowed sterling convertibility in 1947, as required by the loan agreement, the resulting run on sterling reserves was so severe that convertibility had to be suspended within 6 weeks. Britain was managing an empire with a currency that could not be freely converted in a balance of payments that was chronically in deficit. The financial machinery that had built and sustained the empire was broken. The empire itself was therefore unsustainable. Not immediately, not in 1945. The flag still flew. The governors still governed. The Royal Navy still sailed. But the arithmetic was visible to anyone who looked at it. Maintaining a military presence across a quarter of the earth costs money. Maintaining administrative systems, supporting loyal governments, suppressing insurgencies, garrisoning strategic points, all of it costs money. The money comes from the financial surplus generated by the imperial system. If the financial surplus is consumed by war debts, the imperial system cannot sustain itself. This is a calculation that Ernest Bevin, the Labour Foreign Secretary, was making in 1947 when he decided that Britain could no longer maintain its commitments in Greece and Turkey and informed the United States that America would have to take over. The announcement that produced the Truman Doctrine and the beginning of the American Cold War commitment to Europe was, from the British side, an announcement of financial incapacity. Britain could not afford Greece. America would have to manage it. The same calculation applied to India. Indian independence in August 1947 has been taught primarily as the product of the independence movement of Gandhi and Nehru and the Congress Party, of the moral and political pressure that made continued British rule untenable. All of that was real and all of it mattered, but the financial calculation was equally present. India cost Britain money to administer by 1945. The wartime use of Indian resources had generated sterling balances owed to India that Britain could not easily pay. The costs of suppressing the independence movement were rising as the movement grew. The military capacity required to maintain control against a determined independence movement was beyond what the post-war British financial position could sustain. Indian independence was not purely an act of moral recognition. It was also an act of financial triage. Britain could not afford to hold India by force. The pattern repeated across the empire through the late 1940s and 1950s. Palestine was abandoned in 1948 after a guerrilla campaign that combined Jewish terrorism and Arab resistance made maintaining the mandate financially and politically unsustainable. The Gold Coast became Ghana in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence under a government led by Kwame Nkrumah. The British withdrawal was managed and relatively peaceful, partly because a financial analysis showed that the costs of maintaining the Gold Coast as a colony were approaching the benefits. Malaya and Singapore went through the 1950s and early 1960s. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Nigeria. The decolonization of Africa accelerated to the early 1960s as a financial arithmetic became impossible to ignore in territory after territory. Harold Macmillan's Wind of Change speech in Cape Town in February 1960, in which he told the South African Parliament that a wind of change was blowing through Africa and that Britain would not stand in the way of African nationalism, was a public acknowledgement of a decision that the financial position had made for British policy years earlier. The decision was, Britain cannot afford to hold these territories by force against populations that want to be independent. The moral framing was genuine. The financial constraint was what made the moral framing actionable. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is a moment that crystallized a new reality with the least ambiguity. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956. The canal was one of the most strategically important pieces of infrastructure in the world. It connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. It was a route through which oil from the Persian Gulf reached Europe. It was a route through which British forces could be moved rapidly to any point in the empire east of Suez. Britain and France intervened militarily in October 1956 to retake the canal. The military operation was successful. Anglo-French forces were winning. President Eisenhower told them to stop. His instrument was financial. The United States refused to support the pound on the currency markets during the intervention. The pound came under immediate speculative attack. Britain's foreign currency reserves began to drain at a rate that threatened the pound's stability. Britain stopped, not because the military operation had failed, because it could not afford the financial consequences of continuing. The country that had once managed the world's reserve currency had just had its military operation vetoed by the country that now managed the world's reserve currency, and the mechanism of the veto was financial rather than military. Britain withdrew from Suez. Nasser kept the canal. The empire east of Suez became increasingly untenable without the canal as a reliable rapid deployment route. The 1968 decision to withdraw British forces from east of Suez, announced by Harold Wilson's Labour government, was a formal acknowledgement of the strategic reality that Suez had revealed. Britain was a regional power, a significant one, a nuclear-armed one, a permanent member of a United Nations Security Council, a country with real influence in the world, but not a global empire. Not anymore. The pound sterling that had been the world's reserve currency was replaced by the dollar that Britain had borrowed from America to fight 2 world wars. The financial system centered on the City of London that had financed the empire was replaced by the system centered on Wall Street that had financed the wars that ended the empire. The trading networks that had made Britain the hub of the global economy were replaced by American-dominated trading networks that operated in dollars under American rules. Britain had fought to preserve a world in which its empire was the organizing principle of global power. The fighting had destroyed the financial basis of the empire. The world that emerged from the fighting was organized around a different principle, American power, that was simultaneously Britain's closest ally and the successor to Britain's global position. The debt to the United States from the Second World War was finally paid off in December 2006. 61 years after the war ended, the last payment of approximately $83 million was made by the British Treasury on December 29th. 2006. The empire that the war had been fought to preserve had been over for decades by then. The dominions were independent. The colonies were independent. The territories that had once constituted a quarter of the Earth's surface under British administration were governed by their own people under their own flags. The last payment on the war that had cost Britain its empire was made in 2006. The empire had ended in the 1960s. The debt outlasted the empire by 40 years. Cecil Rhodes, who built the British position in southern Africa and who dreamed of a British empire stretching from Cape to Cairo, left money in his will to fund the Rhodes scholarships that bring students from across the world to Oxford University. He believed he was building the intellectual foundation of an empire that would last centuries. The scholarships continue. Oxford continues. The empire does not. Rhodes died in 1902. The empire that he devoted his life to building began its definitive collapse 45 years after his death. Within his lifetime, the empire was at its peak. Within 60 years of his death, it was over. The mountains of Afghanistan that defeated the Soviet Union and defeated the British before them had demonstrated one principle about empire. Military power has limits. The financial system that built the British Empire and was consumed by 2 world wars in defending it demonstrated another. Empires are financial systems. When the financial system fails, the empire fails. The timing varies. The outcome does not. Britain did not lose its empire to its enemies. It spent its empire defeating its enemies. It won the wars. It lost the empire. The last Governor-General of India, Lord Mountbatten, lowered the Union Jack in New Delhi on August 15, 1947. The ceremony was carefully managed, dignified, appropriate to the weight of the moment. Mountbatten shook hands with Nehru. The flag came down. India was independent. The Union Jack that had flown over New Delhi since 1858 was folded and preserved. It is in a museum. The pound that had financed the empire that raised that flag is still the British currency. It is worth less relative to the dollar than it was in 1914. Not dramatically less, but measurably consistently, historically less. The measure of what was lost between 1914 and 1945 is in that exchange rate as much as it is in the flags that came down in territory after territory to the 1950s and 1960s. Britain is still there, still an island, still a significant country, still a member of the Security Council, still a nuclear power, still a country that punches above its weight in international affairs by the measures that diplomatic analysts use to assess such things. But it is not the empire, not the quarter of the earth, not the financial center of the world, not the country whose currency everyone used and whose banks everyone needed. It is the country that fought 2 world wars to protect those things, and in fighting them paid the price of losing them. The wars were necessary. The enemies were real. The cost was the empire. It is, depending on how you look at it, either the most expensive victory in the history of warfare or the most successful defeat. Britain is a country that won and lost simultaneously and is still working out 80 years later which one it was. The answer may depend on what you think the empire was worth. That question does not have a clean answer. The people who administered it have one answer. The people who were administered by it have another. Both answers are in the historical record. The financial record is cleaner. Britain entered the 20th century as the world's largest creditor. It left the first half of the century as the world's largest debtor. The difference is the empire. The cause is the wars. The wars that defended the empire ended the empire. That is the real reason the British Empire collapsed. Everything else is detail.